Chairman Pillay, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to you all. Actually, I should be frightfully remiss if were I to commence this seminar without welcoming what I see is an ever-growing, burgeoning number of who we call friends of ISAS, to this event this afternoon. ISAS is, of course, beholden to all of you for the support that you render it. Not only the intellectual input that you provide at these events, though also that, but by your sheer presence in such numbers, which is a source of tremendous encouragement to us. I hope all of you will see ISAS as a regular port of call in your lives to network with friends, make new ones, and perhaps reshape your thinking on contemporary affairs. We will make your presence here worthwhile this evening by presenting you with a most distinguished speaker, Ibrahim Gambari, who has given me the honor and privilege of calling him a friend. Ibrahim Gambari is a great son of Africa. The CV that we have circulated does him little justice. In his original profession of diplomacy, he has held every position that a diplomat can normally aspire to. He has been the foreign minister of his native Nigeria, permanent representative to the United Nations, a body he has also served as Under Secretary General for many years. And in his case of political affairs, a position which is always thought to be reserved for the most powerful states. He has been a troubleshooter for the Secretary General, for the UN Secretary General, in several global crises. 7 of them we recall yesterday. Pertinent to today's seminar, of course, he has been Secretary General's envoy for Myanmar and laid the foundations, to my mind, of the current international perception of that enigmatic country. I recall that when I was myself appointed foreign minister of my own country, Bangladesh, it was to him that I went that day in New York to seek his advice and counsel. He's also been an academic, has a BSc from LSE, MA and PhD from Columbia University. He's taught at Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, and Harvard Universities. He's been a fellow at Brookings and resident scholar at Bellagio. He's currently with the RSIS and has just been named Chancellor of the Kwara University in Nigeria. And allow me to accord you, Ibrahim, many congratulations for that appointment. Today he'll speak to us of Myanmar, a country which is in the cusp of changes. When its icon of resistance, Aung San Suu Kyi, was about to take a parliamentary seat, a journalist had asked her if this was a historic day. Her response was profound and laconic. Only time will tell, she said. So, what is time telling? The stranglehold of the generals has eased. Slowly but surely, democratic mores are being put in place. A reoriented Myanmar is reaching out to the world. And the world, including region South Asia, is responding most enthusiastically. The interest in the opening up of Myanmar has been huge, including in this country, Singapore. But is everything as it seems? Have the changes unleashed problems that the system is desperately endeavoring to resolve? The riots involving Rohingyas have been violent. Recently, the Rakhine Commission urged the government to immediately resolve the citizenship status of the Rohingyas. At present, they are not accepted as citizens of Myanmar, and recognize their basic human rights. Foreign human rights bodies have been urging the review of the 1982 Citizenship Act. Only last week, there have been deaths from shots fired in anger by the police in Jakarta at those enraged by the treatment meted out to the Muslims in Myanmar. It's not just a question of human rights, though it's also that. There are genuine fears that the Rohingyas may be radicalized in desperation, which will spell great difficulties for the countries of South and Southeast Asia, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Is it possible that the loosening of control of the military is also causing forces to be released in Myanmar that will eventually become difficult to manage? Myanmar is a union, as we discussed yesterday. So will these developments constitute a threat to its territorial integrity? On the economic front, many reforms are necessary to make business with Myanmar feasible and worthwhile. Is the government of Myanmar ready to take these bulls by the horn? More importantly, is it able? So, the fact is, Myanmar is at crossroads. It has generated much hope. At the same time, the fact is, despair may not also be much beyond the rim of the saucer. Myanmar's future will hinge on the choices it makes, the path it decides to take. What is this likely to be? To speak to this and other related matters, I invite my friend and colleague, Ibrahim Gambari. Ibrahim, the microphone is all yours.
I would like to recognize Chairman Pillay for taking the time to come and be with us today, and also, of course, thank my friend and former colleague, Ambassador, Doctor, Foreign Minister, Iftikhar Ahmed Choudhury. Take your pick. And then, of course, we also have among us Ambassador Vanu Menon of the MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is actually an accomplice in getting me to come to Singapore. Because I have been in Darfur for 2 years, 7 months, and a few days. And I retired from the UN, and I was thinking of maybe going back either to my own country, Nigeria, or back to New York, which I adopted as a temporary base. But then he and his colleague conspired to get me here, and here I am since January, and I have 2 more months. Really pleasure to see you, and thank you for getting me to Singapore. I've enjoyed myself so much, put on about 5 pounds a week, sampling all the cuisine from the 3 Day Heritage, and it seems like I have to be dragged out of here at the end of July. Don't worry, my wife is coming. She's going to ensure that I'm dragged out of here. And AS colleagues and their friends. My topic today is Myanmar progress and challenges of political and economic reforms. And because this is ISAS, Iftikhar said I have to talk about the implications for South Asia. So if I'm weak on that other aspect, please forgive me. I'm counting on you in the spirit of the seminar to really fill me in on what are the broader implications for South Asia. But I want to begin by saying that Myanmar is not a country in isolation from the rest of the world. Myanmar is a South Asian country. It's a member of ASEAN and a member of the United Nations, I think an original member. As a matter of fact, it's often forgotten. This very second Secretary General of the United Nations came from Myanmar, then known as functional member of the UN and a member of the international community. So we mustn't look at Myanmar or the efforts to resolve the conflict there in isolation from the rest of the world. And that's why I want to begin by situating conflict management and conflict resolution in a global context. The United Nations, to which almost all countries belong, I think at the last count there are 192 or 93 members of the UN, is premised on the concept of collective security. That is the idea that the threat to peace anywhere should be considered as a threat to peace everywhere, and therefore should be met with a collective response and based on global solidarity. That's the theory. And in many ways, the United Nations is a theory. In many ways, the United Nations Charter is theory, because it has to be translated into reality, into practicality. And when you look at the reality, the record of the international community and of the UN in conflict management and conflict resolution is mixed. In fact, I recall it was the late President de Gaulle of France, who was very angry at the UN at one time, and he said, this is not United Nations, this is disunited nations. And in many ways, the United Nations is often appear as if they are disunited instead of being united. Because they don't always speak with one voice, they don't always pull in the same direction. And I think the situation in Syria shows that they can't even agree on what's, that is the big powers, the big five, do not agree on the way forward. In conflicts such as Myanmar, as well as several others, the attitude of the big powers is the following. If there are two sides, the big powers, by and large, give the carrots to their side and try to apply the sticks to the other side. And that is also what has happened in many ways to the mediation in Myanmar, which I will speak about in more detail, which is that you have a toolbox to the mediator. I was, I think, the third Special Envoy of United Nations in Myanmar in about 20 years. Somebody wrote an article and called me third time lucky in question mark. But I was the third. And you are given a toolbox. In this toolbox, given by the international community, supposed to be sticks and carrots. But for the most part, the big powers who support one side only give you or expect you to use only sticks. I can be quite open here in the spirit of a seminar that the Western countries are only interested in putting sticks in your toolbox. And Russia and China, some carrots. But even those carrots are not in your hands. They keep it in their hands. And the Western countries, in terms of carrots, they wait till the end when they hand out the carrots themselves. So here you are, the mediator, given a toolbox, and the big powers cannot even agree among themselves, you know, the way forward, and they give you different types of, if at all they do, different kinds of incentives. So I'm arguing that in spite of the disunity of the UN, in spite of the fact that on many crises they cannot agree, that's the only organization we have, you know, the United Nations. And so if it's not working well, we have to try to make it work well. Because sometimes they get it right, and they've got peacekeeping right in many places, East Timor, Mozambique, and they've got it disastrously wrong, like in Myanmar. But in general, on the positive side, there's been a 40% decline in violent conflicts since 1992, according to a recent Human Security report. And the report attributes this in part to the efforts by the UN, and also in part to the end of the Cold War, where at least at the beginning, there was a pressure on the part of the big powers to try to reach consensus. That's why if you look at the end of the Cold War, say, put the end of Cold War 1999, thereabouts. If you look at the first 5 years, if you go and check the veto power in the security, hardly ever used. In fact, there was a pressure to reach consensus on almost all issues. So Since the end of the Cold War, most conflicts have ended through negotiations than ever before, with the UN being called upon to engage in all continents: Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So that's why I feel that we need to better understand the reasons why the UN succeeds in some conflicts and why they fail miserably in others. And in doing so, we have to recognize that the status of the nature of conflicts have changed, the root causes of conflicts are broader, the actors are more varied. In this regard, three changes stand out clearly. If you compare the period after the end of the Cold War to the period before, there are now more intrastate conflict than interstate conflict. No, a lot more conflict within countries rather than between countries, which makes it more complicated, because you also have in one of the principal charters of the UN, elements of the Charter of the UN, is Article 2, subsection 7, which says nothing in the UN permits it to interfere in what is considered to be essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of member states. So there's built into the charter, the fact that, interference in internal affairs of countries is not welcome. So you have that. And yet, most of the conflicts the UN is supposed to deal with are more fight within countries than between countries. The second dimension is that we now have more non-state actors involved in conflict. Before, when you had the interstate conflicts, you have countries, you have defined borders. Even when they fight, maybe you have regular armies, and you can separate them. Now you have more non-state actors, all kinds of people, armed militias, warlords, terrorist organizations, all kinds of people are involved, taking one side on it, which makes it even more complicated to resolve. And the third, I would say that the root causes of conflicts are broader and deeper when there are more non-state actors involved. Even to get to know what it is they want is a problem, because you have so many types, and the root causes are bigger. But in my experience, and thank you very much for referring me to as having the Special Envoy on so many occasions. Actually, somebody called me once. He said, Ibrahim Gambari, UN Special Envoy to world dictators. Because they always send me to, at that time, Myanmar, Angola, Cyprus to some extent, Zimbabwe. And I said, well, actually, I don't mind, because first, as long as you don't say I'm friends of dictators, it's fine. Because somebody has to talk to. You can't make peace with your friends. You make peace with those with whom you have fundamental disagreements. And the UN has to talk to everybody. Everybody. I recall when I was head of political affairs, and I went to Lebanon, and I came back to report to the Secretary General, John Bolton, who was then the US ambassador. By the way, many times countries send ambassadors to the UN. People who actually hate the UN, they send them as ambassadors, because they don't want actually agreements. Now, so he called and said, Mr. Under Secretary General, I understand you were in Lebanon. I said, yes, sir. And you saw Hezbollah. I said, yes, I did. He said, don't you know that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, and by so doing, you are encouraging terrorism? And I listened very patiently, and I said, well, we are the UN. You may decide not to talk to somebody, but we have to talk to everyone. Not to please remember that one of your predecessors, I think it was Andrew Young, American ambassador to the UN, he was sacked. You know what? Because he was talking to Yasser Arafat of the PLO. He was sacked. He lost his job. So the enemies of yesterday will be your ally today or tomorrow, as PLO is now one of the most reliable partners in the peace process in the Middle East. So we can't write everybody off. So Myanmar cannot be seen outside this context. I will not go into further details because I know you want to hear more about Myanmar. But please remember, Myanmar is not an isolation. It's not that from the rest of the world. It's not in isolation from ASEAN. It's not in isolation from the United Nations. And it is the instruments that regional organizations such as ASEAN, instruments such as the UN develop to handle the conflict that were used. So it's very important to understand what those instruments are. Now, one last point before I move on is that it's really that if you want to solve conflict, you have to identify who are the spoilers in the peace process and how to handle spoilers. Part of the problem is that many times, if there are two parties, the other one thinks the other is the spoiler. I'm the good guy, is that one that is then. And in Myanmar, I can tell you when I started this process of mediation, and I was received by the Senior General, and I told him, sir, I would like to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi. Don't forget, at that time, you are not even supposed to mention the name Aung San Suu Kyi. You have to say the lady, you know, or ASSK, you know, because to mention the name, you know, it's like to legitimize. Say, why would you want to meet her? You know, she's no good, you know. I said, well, but I'm a mediator. I have to, if you want to make peace, you have to talk to everybody. And I recall again when I went to see, finally he agreed, and I went to see her, and I said, well, you know, madam, you have to talk to the general. She said, I can't talk to them, they are terrible. They try to kill me, they can't be trusted. And I said, well, you may be right, but they are the people who put you where you are, and they're the only ones who can get you out of there. So, do you want to stay in where you are, the leader of your party, but you are not playing any political role, or you want us to talk to this? It may not lead to anything, but if we don't, the way to guarantee that there will be no result is not to talk to them. So, how do we deal with spoilers when each side thinks the other is the spoiler? So, all kinds of inducement, some sticks if you have it, but or just persuasion. Then I mentioned also about regional organization. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Africa has the most developed regional organization in the developing world for conflict resolution and peacekeeping. Nobody thinks of it that way, but it is. They have an organization that's for the whole continent, North, South, Muslim, Christians, Arabs, North Arab, the organization, the African Union, 53 members. And they do peacekeeping, they do peacemaking. They participate with the UN as peacekeepers in peacekeeping operations. I say this because the same is not true of ASEAN, which seems to be a bit reluctant to do peacekeeping, let alone peace enforcement. Because right now the AU is doing with the UN peace enforcement in both Darfur and Somalia. Now, you have to now let me know what South Asia is doing. The organization, I know there is an organization, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, for regional cooperation. But if you situate it in terms of peacekeeping and peacemaking, you'll find that there's still a lot of room for improvement. Now, Myanmar. Since 1993, the absence of consensus among the key international countries on how best to deal with the issue of grave human rights abuses and democracy deficits, the UN Secretary General has opted for a low-key approach. So he has designated special envoys and special advisors to do the heavy lifting in the process. See, when the big powers cannot agree on what to do, they say, let the Secretary General do it. You know why? It has a lot of advantage. If the Secretary General succeeds, it's a win-win situation for the big powers. If the Secretary General succeeds, they take the credit. That's the deal. And if he fails, they put the blame on him. Sometimes they even remove him, or they do, or make life impossible for him, or don't give him a second term. This is a fact. And I recall Mr. Kofi Annan, who used to, in the UN, when we refer to the Secretary General, we call him by acronym SG, Secretary General. And he told me, he said, you know, he said, Ibrahim, you don't know what SG actually means. I said, well, Secretary General. I said, no, scapegoat. That is the, when they fail to do something, when they are not living up to their responsibility, you blame. And yet, when they give him the job, it's not as if they give him all the tools. I've given you the example of even the mediation. They don't give you the tools that is appropriate, but yet, it's over to you. But in pursuing the Secretary General's good offices, that's why it's called good offices. I recall when I gave a speech in New York, Washington, D.C., and this will surprise you, second surprise. You think that You are in Washington. This is the seat of the only superpower left with all these think tanks and, you know, universities world class, you know, Princeton, Yale, Harvard. But amazingly enough, when it comes to policy or knowledge about the rest of the world, that's a big question mark. Because when I was talking about good office rule of the Secretary General and how there are all kinds of challenges, so somebody in the audience at I don't want to name the big think tank, but it's very well known in Washington. Said, Mr. Gambari, are you complaining that the Secretary General refused to give you a good office? we can give you a better office. You can move to Washington. We'll give you a better office. Now, the good offices means when the big powers cannot agree, when a country, and yet at the same time you can't send somebody against the will of the country, then the Secretary General has to use his good offices, which is just to try to persuade, to try to cajole, to try to encourage. Okay. Give you another constraint about the good office rule of the Secretary General, because it's very important that I bring the limitations to you. Condoleezza Rice once called my office. I said, ask his people to call me to say, what's all this thing about Gambari always going around ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand. You should go to Myanmar and sit there, you know, all this go around to get support. It's not, that's not the way. You should sit there and I should refuse to leave. I should just go there until I get Aung San Suu Kyi out, you know. And I said, is that so? I said, in fact, okay, please tell her. Very simple. I'll be delighted to go to Myanmar. Let her just get me a visa to get it. The Secretary of State of the most powerful country in the world at that time cannot guarantee me a visa to go to Myanmar. Guess who I have to go to? I'm sure people can guess who I have to go to. If I need a visa, I'm having difficulty because Myanmar has to agree for me to come. China. Just to get a visa. So it shows you the difficulties. But at the same time, they are prepared. That is, the Myanmar is prepared for a low-key approach, using the good office of the Secretary General. They are in charge of the process. It is their process, okay? And that is why you are able to proceed. And there are a few principles that I believe was very useful in guiding me in the good office rule of the Secretary General. And I'm sure Ambassador Vanu Menon has had this so many times, so forgive me. We're going to hear it another time, which was that there are about 4 principles that guided the good office role of the Secretary. The first is that the Secretary General's good offices is a process and not an event. Because really, people expect that when you go there, you just go and you succeed and you come out with Aung San Suu Kyi in your hands as release. Well, it doesn't work that way. You start a process. You try to get Aung San Suu Kyi and the government that were not talking to start talking, to have some political process. That's very, very important. It's not an event, but a process. Second, that given the complexities of the Myanmar conflict, our approach should not be reduced to a single issue. In other words, if all I was coming to say to the general was release Aung San Suu Kyi, my mission has failed before I even go in. So you have to find out what is it that interests them. Okay? How do you engage beyond a single issue? So you talk about humanitarian situation, you talk about the development possibilities, you talk about your appreciation of the task they have, having peace, making peace with the armed groups that they've been fighting for, armed minorities for, what, 40 years? Even as we speak, all you have is a ceasefire between the government and these groups. They still keep their guns. And one of them, Kaczynski, there's not even a ceasefire agreement. So you talk about things that is important to them and that are real, they are not manufacturing it. And then, of course, you talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, human rights, democracy, and all of that. So not one issue. You have to have things that are common to both sides that will give you the entree, because if you are not even there to talk, how can you be successful? And it is, again, not theory. My predecessor, Razali, who was, is even from this region, he's from Malaysia, For 2.5 years, they did not let him inside. So how can you do your good officer role if you cannot even get in the country? So you have to have access, and in order to have access, you have to talk about things that interest both sides. The third is that engagement with the government and with the opposition cannot be ends by themselves, because you see, they don't mind you coming if all you do is just come and go, right? So you have to let them know, yeah, you keep coming, but there has to be tangible results from time to time. And in the case of Myanmar, from time to time, they will release 50, 100 political prisoners, in other words, to justify the continuation of the good officer's role. So, tangible results. Now, interestingly enough, it's easier to get tangible results, to demand and get tangible results from the government than from Aung San Suu Kyi, because she's not in position to give, tangible results, other than maybe the willingness to continue to engage. Although sometimes she gets fed up. Third and final principle is that you have to engage with all those inside and outside the country who can contribute to addressing Myanmar's challenges. So, the armed groups, the opposition, the government, and then in the region, Singapore, Thailand, complicated relationship, but you have to touch base there, Indonesia, And then interestingly enough, those countries, the LVM, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia, they are close to Myanmar. And so it's important to get in touch with them so that they can also support you. And above all, of course, the countries, China and India. Usually before I go in, I go to India before I go to see if they can help me smooth the path before I go. Or if I have a very bad meeting afterwards, in Myanmar, I go back to say, well, this last something was not very productive. Please help out. So now that was then. Dramatically, things open up. But the good of Israel was that kind of, it's like chipping, you just keep chipping. I went to Myanmar 12 times, 12, in between 2006 and 2009. I was received by Aung San Suu Kyi 11 times. There was a time she refused to see me, and maybe in the question and answer period we might, discuss that. So you keep making the arguments. And I'll tell you what works the most, in my view, is when you give ownership of the process to the parties. In other words, you put yourself aside, and you say, it is your process. And in the case of the government, I told them, you have a 7-step, what is it called? 7 steps, roadmap to democracy. So I said, I don't want to replace that 7 steps. It's your step. However, the first step, which is National Convention, has taken 14 years, right? When I came, 14. So I said, well, at this rate, well, by the time we get to the 3rd step, we'll all be dead, if we go including Aung San Suu Kyi. So what I said, this is your process, but can we, let me see how you can kind of quicken it a little bit. And I'm proud to say, I know people, my critics don't give me credit for this. I was part of the process whereby they moved from step 1 to step 5. By the time I left, it was step 5. Step 5 was election, step 6 was the convening of parliament, step 7 was the handover of power to the... So, and similarly, I told Aung San Suu Kyi that, well, you can decide, you have 2 choices. You can refuse to be engaged, yes, but you must still be in detention, and then, of what use is that to your party, the NLD, which has, she calls the leaders of the NLD the uncles, because they are the same age as her father, So, and the party needs rejuvenation, reform. You can't do it when you are in detention. Okay? Sometimes she listens to me, of course, sometimes she does not. For example, when I argue that the role of a political party is to take part in elections. Why would have a political party? They say that election is flawed, the constitution is awful, the election is going to be skewed. Well, that may be the case, but I was convinced then, and proved right, that without that election, the prospect of releasing her would be very, very slim. Anyway, the rest is history. There was time was right. The leaders, combination of factors, internal, external, they decided to open up, and the rest is history. Now, Myanmar is in a state whereby all the opponents of yesterday have become the biggest allies. President Obama is there, Cameron, the Prime Minister, all this, they are anxious to go there. Businessmen, everybody, they want to go to Myanmar, which is of course appropriate. Now, I'm going to argue that in the end, what mattered the most in terms of the process of the UN is to broaden the discussion, not one issue. So when Cyclone, what is that? Nargis, when it happened, it's a terrible thing, but it was an opening where the Secretary then went, was received, and he said, well, you know, let's talk about this. By the way, he didn't take me along when he went. You know why? Because he didn't want to confuse my own political role with the humanitarian. So he took the humanitarian, the head of humanitarian affairs. But while there, they talked about other things. And the Secretary himself, being there, was a plus. Secondly, ESCAP. Is that ESCAP? It's, I don't think ESCAP has a lot of money. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think they have a lot of money. But they have legitimacy. So they were encouraged to go in. And then that signals that maybe there's some possibility of opening. Soon the World Bank, IMF, they've now gone in. So by broadening the discussion, you get the support of the government, which is the key player. So, as a matter of fact, in the jargon of the UN, you have prevention before the guns start, peacekeeping if the guns temporarily stops, and peace building to consolidate the peace. So, in the case of Myanmar, we were also doing elements of peace building, even while the conflict was still going on. So, Cyclone Nargis gave an opportunity, the UN agencies got involved, and the conversation was broadened. And as I mentioned, it's very, very important, I want to repeat, the key is to let the parties to a conflict own the process. Okay. By the way, it helped the fact that when I first went to Myanmar, and I sat with Jonathan Sui, I said, I'm not here to come and preach democracy to you or human rights. Because although I'm an international civil servant, I'm from Nigeria. And we've had our own share of being a pariah country, resolutions upon resolution against us. I was ambassador of my country to the UN. I had to stomach all of this for years. But I told him, I said, I was the same man who, when my country was a pariah state, and now the same ambassador helped my country, contributed to it, persuaded the generals who are also running the country to move in the direction of democratization and human rights. And guess what? By 1999, my country became a respected member of the international community again. So I say, I'm offering myself to work with you to see how we can move in that direction. And by the way, that resonated in two ways. First, that I'm not coming here to hit them on the head with a particular form of democracy. Two, that I'll keep pushing for release of political prisoners, for engagement of Aung San Suu Kyi, but that it is your country, it is your process, and it's your choice to remain a pariah state or to become a respected member of the international community. And then the second thing, and in my conclusion I mentioned it, is that you have to be prepared to bluff and to say, well, as I did, I said, well, at that time, as head of political affairs, I said I was handling 18 conflicts all over the world. So I said, Senior General, if you don't want me, that's okay, I'll leave. I have 17 other problems that I have to deal with in the world, you know. But that worked for some time. But then when I lost the position of Undersecretary for Political Affairs and I was reduced to being a special envoy to Myanmar and Iraq, I couldn't use that same bluff again. But you use whatever you can, you know, to gain access. Because as I said, access, you have to gain the access, you have to gain the trust and the confidence of both parties. You know, if one or the other do not have confidence in you, your task will be virtually impossible. And meanwhile, the big powers are pushing you in one direction, or the other. So ownership of the process, impartiality, willingness to call it quits and to say, well, I've had enough, or that this is not working. And that's not always easy for people with large egos. Because actually, to be a special envoy, you have to have some kind of ego. Because why do you think you can succeed when everybody else has failed? But you must also keep your ego at check. Because I remember, and I'm not going to mention the person, but he's somebody not too far from here who was made special envoy to resolve a conflict in Europe. And he said, oh, the Gambari approach is too slow. You know, I am, special envoy, but former minister of a developed country. I'm going to go to this place, and 3 months I will solve that problem. Well, that was in 2007. He's still there. The gentleman is still there. Because it's not in your hands to fix. You can only play a role Now, what are the challenges? Several. First, the political and economic reform process in Myanmar is by no means irreversible. They've gone a long way. And I'm told that, as a matter of fact, President Thein Sein has said that the road that Myanmar is going is so narrow of reform that there's no room to even turn back. That is his word. So narrow. Now, but there are all kinds of issues, as you know. First, how to amend the constitution. Because if you don't amend the constitution, Aung San Suu Kyi is not even eligible to be president of that country now. Okay? And I'm just using that as an example of the need to amend the constitution. Second, the issue of citizenship in Myanmar. Who is a citizen and who is not? Particularly when it comes to the Rohingyas issue. And the plight of the Rohingyas in Rakhine State is real and is spreading. Also among the challenges is a growing anti-Muslim sentiment and violence, both in western and central Myanmar. And then, of course, the ongoing military confrontation and clashes between the government forces and those of the armed minority nationalities. And peace is still elusive. The economy itself, you know how it is. After having a command economy, everything centralized, to suddenly go the other way, it's not going to be easy at all for any country, but particularly a country that has also been, by choice, has been pretty much out of circulation, international circulation, for a very, very long time. In the minutes that is remaining, let me talk about the implications for South Asia and then some conclusions. According to a recent IMF study on Myanmar, based on 2011 Article 4 consultations published in May last year, Myanmar, and I quote, could become the next economic frontier in Asia, end of quote. This will, however, require pursuit of appropriate reforms by the government to convert Myanmar's rich natural resources, young labor force, and this is what I think is important for South Asia, proximity to the most dynamic economies, how to turn all of this to its advantage. And for that, you will need an all-inclusive economic growth and what the economists call macroeconomic stability. Furthermore, according to the IMF report that I'm citing, long-standing distortions will require cross-cutting reform in and removing impediments to growth by enhancing the business and investment climate, encouraging financial sector development, and further liberalizing trade and foreign direct investment. So there are a lot of things that still needs to be done. They are in the right direction, but in order to take advantage of this proximity to South Asia, this has to be done again faster. And I'm arguing, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, that just as Myanmar needs to take advantage of its proximity to some of the most dynamic economies, including countries of South Asia should take advantage of the openings and the opportunities provided by Myanmar to modernize its economy, reduce poverty, build human capital in a mutually beneficial way. So as Myanmar is opening up and reducing poverty, developing human capacity, opening up its market, there's a role for some of the most dynamic economies in the region to take advantage. And some of the outlook is good. According to IMF economic outlook in Myanmar, they conclude that it's positive. It's positive. With real GDP growth projected at 5.5% in fiscal year 2011 to 12, and at 6% in fiscal year 2013. These are not my figures, these are IMF figures. And although these growth rates were driven by commodity exports and higher investment, supported by robust credit growth, consistent monetary policy framework, and improving public financial management. So still, whatever the driver, it is happening. And people should take advantage. And by the way, what I'm saying about Myanmar is also relevant to Africa. I can't resist mentioning that. For a long time, people look at Africa as a continent. In fact, the Economist had a publication one week, Africa, the hopeless continent. Right? It's the same Economist about a month ago that said, hey, we are missing something here. This is the fastest growing continent in the world at 6% and likely to be for the next 5-10 years. Don't let us be caught behind. By the way, the Chinese were the first to realize the potential of Africa, and never mind all these things you hear about how China is exploiting Africa and all of that. This is the view of those who used to regard Africa as their backyard, and they are now facing competition. It's not that the Chinese have not made mistakes, they have made mistakes now, and they are still making, but they are the first to seize the opportunity in Africa. So let South Asia and others seize the opportunity in Myanmar. And I will also say that the development of physical infrastructures could link Myanmar through including, for example, Bangladesh by extension to the road and railway network in South Asia, all the way, in fact, through that to, you have India, Pakistan, Nepal, all the places that could be linked up if somehow South Asia takes the lead in moving in the direction of taking advantage of the opportunities in Myanmar. Because then that will facilitate trade, goods and services, again to the benefit of all. And as I mentioned on the political front, addressing the plight of the Rohingya, the violence that has erupted between the Buddhists and the Rohingya Muslims, especially in Rakhine State, by the Myanmar authority is in a firm but fair manner will remove the fallout from this issue on countries in South Asia and even Southeast Asia. We've seen how in Jakarta, the fallout is already been there. And some of the racist attitude and some of the anti-Muslim sentiments on quarters in Myanmar, if not discouraged and dealt with properly, will very much undermine the goodwill, tremendous goodwill that Myanmar is enjoying in the world. Look at it, 2014, next year, they'll be hosting the ASEAN Summit. They tried to host it before, 2008, and ASEAN said no. Defiant. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, the European Union lifted permanently all the sanctions against Myanmar except for arms embargo. I mentioned earlier, everybody is going there now. President Obama, Cameron, everybody. So the goodwill is there, including, by the way, goodwill from the Organization of Islamic Conference that even wanted to open an office in Yangon. Organization of Islamic Conference is an organization of 53 countries in the world, 53. So all that goodwill could very well be squandered if there is not a firm but fair handling of that crisis. If you don't check the anti-Muslim sentiment, that could be very well squandered. And somebody once told me that international capital is a coward. They don't like to go where things don't look right. So this goodwill, which is tremendous, is very important that it's not squandered. Let me then conclude by very briefly to say that first, to end as I began, Myanmar should be seen in the context of the region and the world. So there's a need, just as ASEAN and Southeast Asia has or can play a role in helping Myanmar to further move in political and economic reform, this should not be taken for granted. Myanmar is not alone, but in order not to be alone again, it has to continue along the path of economic and political reform. Also, that efforts of the outsiders to be involved or to be helpful must be very clear that you're only there. Let me use the Hollywood analogy. You know, they have a category of Oscar, or they have a category called actors in a supporting role. Am I correct? Actors. The heart to Myanmar is to outsiders to regard themselves as actors in a supporting role, not to try to become the lead actors. It's their country. They're very proud people. And I recall again, just to share with you, the first time I met Jonathan Shui, and I told him that I wanted to meet Madame ASSK, and he said, after all, when he finally agreed, he said, I want to warn you though, one. He said, you'll find ASSK very stubborn person, like all of us Burmese. So there's a stubbornness, a pride that, you know, is very important you have to let them be the lead and be there to support. You have to take the lead. You have to own the process. Because it was the ownership of the process that got them where they are now, and the ownership of the process that will also move them along the path of reform. So one last word, and this is the question. There's a debate. What made Myanmar change? Is it the Western sanctions or the mediation? The Western countries, I'm told, they said, yeah, what is happening is because we had sanctions. Now, I think that's a big question mark, because don't forget, there was never a United Nations approved sanctions on Myanmar. Some countries did on their own. And any sanction that is not internationally sanctioned, the chances of real success is very limited. China never supported sanctions. India, these are the two big neighbors, never supported sanctions. ASEAN did not support sanctions. Japan did not support sanctions. Okay. Now, to also argue that it was the mediation that turned to turn the table will also be exaggerating it, unless you define mediation as actor in a supporting role, because it's often said that a conflict can only be resolved when it is ripe for resolution. In fact, it has to be ripe for resolution. So timing is key. That timing is not in the hands of the mediator, it's in the hands of the parties. But what the mediator can do, what I've tried to do as a mediator, as a third, and there's one there now, is to try to ripen. You don't wait till it's ripe, just have to ripen the situation for resolution. And that's what I think, above all, what the international community has tried to do, which is to ripen the moment for resolution. But the timing was in the hands, the leadership was in the hands of the parties, and they've seized it. But they now need to consolidate it. Well, I've spoken too long. But that's what happens when you have somebody who is a professor by training and an ambassador by accident. Thank you.